1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Allô? Tu m'entends?
In our study of the life divine, Sri Aurobindo has been describing in the chapter titled Man and the Evolution, the entire framework of evolution, so that we may understand how this framework will assist us in the next step. But first, he has taken up a very challenging problem. The idea that evolution does not in fact exist. And this idea, he says, needs to be dealt with because it has great importance, it has a compelling character, it is also very rational, cogent. And then, in the portion we are reading now, he places before us this whole idea where evolution has been doubted, questioned. Do you really need an evolution to explain all that you are seeing? Even if you accept that the universe emerges out of these 7 principles, even if you accept that the inconscient is the base out of which the spirit emerges, even if you accept rebirth as a fact, still, he says, a spiritual evolution of the individual being is not an inevitable consequence. And then he proceeds to show you how nature has organized many types of beings in a hierarchy, many levels, and each of these types, although it grows in complexity within its type, is always bound within the perimeter and the limitation that the type is defined by. We will in fact, he says, see that each type begins with a tiny molecule or animalcule or plantcule equivalent, which grows out, becomes more and more complex and rich, but always stays within its type. And the logic which he places is so clear that we even begin to doubt whether there could be an evolution, because with this, everything is explained. Or so it seems. One of the key points which comes from this perspective is there is no purpose. There is no greater objective. There is no goal towards which things have to grow. Everything is there. And it's already there. It's already complete. Every level of consciousness which needs to be represented is there. And the human being assuming still that the human is the most developed, the human being can grow, maybe continue to grow within that little band of the mind, but that's about all. If at all there is going to be another species of a new consciousness, it's not going to come out of the human. At best it can come out from its own means. But there is nothing in the human which shows you any sign that you're growing towards that. Even he says the only thing you see in the human is a kind of a spiritualized mental beings who are trying to escape the terrestrial creation. But other than that, you do not see any tendency of a new species emerging out of the human. All are bound within the Swabhava, Swadharma, natural temperament, native law and limits in which the species is defined. Although he does mention that the human is still the most complex that has been created, the richest in content of consciousness and ingenuity in the construction of the human being. All this having been accepted, we still don't see any sign that there has to be another step and purpose, or even that there is an evolution. As humans, we remain better humans, but human always. And so far, the logic is so compelling that a casual reader reading this might even be convinced that Sri Aurobindo has decided that there is no evolution. And I'm saying this not as a joke. In fact, I have seen in certain discussion groups online some scholars who are professors of philosophy in their own right declaring that in the Life Divine, in these later chapters, Sri Aurobindo himself doubted whether evolution exists. And it's precisely this passage that they have read, and they could not make out that Sri Aurobindo is only presenting the opposite viewpoint, which then he will refute. But it is so compelling. And this is one of the characteristics of Sri Aurobindo, that when he presents a contrary viewpoint, he does it so well. He really takes that position thoroughly. And he can do this because in his consciousness, in the supramental vision, every viewpoint is justified. It may have limitations within which it is justified, but every viewpoint is justified. And this is one of those viewpoints. Why it is important to face this is because it does fit the data. And in fact, this is an underlying first level of truth. In a more superficial level perhaps, but still it is the first level of truth that we meet. And so in stating this contrary viewpoint that there is no evolution, Sri Aurobindo is showing you one layer of reality. Now, this being the case, and nature normally operating within this framework, he will then take you a step behind. And when you go to that second layer of reality, you will see, but there is some power which can work beyond this and somehow bypass this or moderate or modulate this. And then he'll take you a third layer behind. And from there you will see the real control is here. And from here you modify second layer, and then you can modify first layer. And the true drivers of evolution are there, not in this layer. So the beauty of this poise and the justification of this and the importance given to it over so many pages is that it's not just a logical thinking and philosophical argumentation. It is in fact a revelation of a perspective and experience of reality which is quite compelling and true in itself within its limits. And so in the process of revealing this, we also saw how he is also showing you insights into the mechanism of evolution, which will be useful for us to understand how the next step is to emerge. In the immediate importance of this, we find that this is in fact the view of certain religious traditions. If you go to study most of the Abrahamic traditions, in Islam in particular, but also in an early form of Christianity and in certain lineages of Judaism, there is always this idea that God created the world in one go. And everything is there already as it should be. And it's perfectly in place. There is nothing to be done. There is no goal. There is no evolution, therefore. And one day, when the whole game's purpose is finished, God will say enough and wind it down. And this idea is so strong that for centuries, in many of these traditions, the greatest minds have been busy trying to figure out when the world is going to end. So, if you take an example of modern scientific tradition in Europe, one of the greatest scientists to this day, one of the greatest physicists is Newton. Newton was also a mystic. He was also very deeply religious in the biblical tradition. He was convinced that the world had to end because it had been started on a particular date when God said, this is how it should be. So looking through the Bible, he figured out when the world will end. It was to be about 100 years after his time, and it did not happen. But today, when you find, and I've been in such discussions around the world, when you find this kind of destruction of the environment, the decline of civilization, the collapse of the ecosystems, and the extinctions of so many species of animals and plants, the same people say, these are the signs of end of times. And so, what's the response? Rather than saying, let's save the situation, well, the world is going to end soon, so we better do what we need to do before it ends. And not try to protect, not try to change, not try to save the environment. And all of this behavior pattern is so rooted in that system, in that perspective of thinking, that you cannot introduce the concept of evolution. They simply reject it because they are so convinced of this. And here Sri Aurobindo gives you that vision. You can understand now how that mind works. But you can also now find the second layer and third layer of reality by which to that mind, if it is open, you can awaken the insight of evolution itself. And this is why this whole passage is so important. And rather than summarizing it, we are exploring it in detail. The objections to evolution are being stated, and later Sri Aurobindo will show you how they are countered from the deeper layers of reality. So we are in the last portion, the last two paragraphs, where Sri Aurobindo is still completing this position which denies evolution. If indeed man has evolved in nature out of the animal, yet now we see that no other animal type shows any signs of an evolution beyond itself. So if it was true that we have evolved, others also should be under pressure of evolution. In fact, one of the surprising things is all of the creatures which existed during the time of the dinosaur extinction, 64 million years ago about, all those creatures which existed then still are exactly the same. The alligator, crocodiles are one such. There are a few others who were present at that time. They have not evolved even one tiny bit. Exactly the same bone structures that you find at the time of the dinosaur is what you find today. If then there was this evolutionary stress in the animal kingdom, it must have sunk back into quiescence as soon as the object was fulfilled by man's appearance. So the idea here is, perhaps there is a stress that pushes evolution a little bit in a species, but it's not there in all species. If it was a general tendency in all species, then just as the human being evolved, other animals should have been evolving also. So the only explanation you can say is maybe there is a stress which pushed from ape to human and then subsided because now it's not there in the apes anymore. They have remained what they were at that time. And no other species has it. So perhaps it's possible that there is a temporary push of a stress of evolution in a species, but it has to subside. So too, if there is any such stress for a new step in evolution, for self-exceeding, it is likely to subside into quiescence as soon as its object is fulfilled by the supramental being's appearance. And this point is what the mother makes. Out of humanity, a small part which is aspiring, which feels the urge, the need to realize a higher consciousness and live in it and by its terms. That small part will rise. And during the time when nature is participating in this push, the transition takes place, and when the new species emerges, the urge in nature will subside. And the rest of humanity, which is momentarily lifted by this urge, will also subside. And the mother's observations are somewhat disturbing when you think of its implications. She says, once this transition is completed, the urge in humanity, which you see now to be so creative and look forward to things, that will actually fall back, and even some of the higher faculties of the intellect will lapse back, and humanity will fall to a level which is its norm. And so you can imagine what would happen in that stage, a new species now living in a higher consciousness, and the mass of humanity slightly dipping from where it is now in terms of its intellectual creativity and curiosity. A dullness of the intellect even falling back. And we can understand what this means only when you look at the larger span of time. Consider all over the world. When have these idealistic, high-thinking impulses emerged? Not 1,000 years ago. Not 500 years ago. Barely 100 or 150 years ago. Barely. And even there, you find the form that it takes is within certain limits. Oh, perhaps we are going to emerge into something new. Perhaps a greater life is possible. And it takes a very rationalistic, scientific, materialistic form. But still the push is there. In Sri Aurobindo's writings, when he wrote The Life Divine, when he wrote this, it's 100 years ago. At that time, we see a large number of thinkers around the world looking forward to something like this. But it only means that at that point the push had begun. Sri Aurobindo articulated it in this way, and the push rising, when it finishes, all this kind of thinking is going to sink back to what used to be 200 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. And that will be normal humanity. And so this description of urge is important because Sri Aurobindo puts it as an argument, but in fact this is one of those mechanisms which nature will use. Then he continues, but there is no such stress in reality. That's the logic of the opposite position. The idea of human progress itself is very probably an illusion. Now this viewpoint comes in many of the Abrahamic traditions, where they speak of this very simply. Nothing has changed in the last 1,000 years. What has changed? You have only built upon some previous knowledge, and each time you have added a little bit of incremental change, but fundamentally we are still what we were. For there is no sign that man, once emerged from the animal stage, has radically progressed during his race history. At most, he has advanced in knowledge of the physical world, in science, in the handling of his surroundings, in his purely external and utilitarian use of the secret laws of nature. If you think about it, that's what it is. When we say humanity has progressed so much, well, in the scientific knowledge, in the utilitarian use of nature's laws, that's it. How have we changed as a people? We still fight the way we used to fight 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Only at that time you had to struggle to fight. You had to have courage to go and attack somebody, even to throw stones, beat with a stick. And with the invention of the gun, that courage requirement became much smaller. You only had to pull a finger and you go bang, somebody is dead. The requirement of courage physically, the strength physically has dropped. So now anybody can pull a gun. Or take it a couple of steps further, now with the technology you have, you program a target on the computer push a button and the missile goes and blows out 100 people. Precisely. It doesn't need much courage because you don't even see them, you don't even know whether they're human beings or not, whether they exist or not. This is in fact part of the difficulty which the people in this kind of warfare face. You may have seen certain movies where they show you somebody sitting in the United States in the Air Force base is controlling a drone that is in the Middle East. They're monitoring somebody who's in a car, they push a button and the missile goes and blows up the car. And they take great pains in these movies to show the person feeling guilt, because that's the message they want to give to you. In fact, the person feels nothing. It's just a picture, it's a video game. And it's a problem to make them realize that you have to be careful. It's not a game, that there are what it means to have lives at stake. It's in fact a problem because we are so disconnected from the reality of what is being done. And so all you see is the change and growth in the external technology, but the human being does not appear to have changed. But otherwise, he is what he always was in the early beginnings of civilization. He continues to manifest the same capacities, the same qualities and defects, the same efforts, blunders, achievements, frustrations. When you think about the psychology of the human being, and so much of this goes into the very base of modern psychology, and in the last 100 years in Europe, the basis of psychology has been the whole basal instincts of humanity, the animal instincts which are our primary drives: food, procreation, survival, protection against danger, security, and so on. And upon that base, all the complex behaviors have been, so to say, mapped out. There is this thing called Maslow's pyramid, where they say you satisfy the lowest needs and then a few more needs pop up. Satisfy those, a few more, and that's about it. Fulfill all those needs and you can control a human being. You can make him behave any way he wants as long as you're fulfilling those needs and manipulating him. And if you think about it, in fact it's true for a very large part of humanity. It's not absolutely true because there are still human beings who say, oh, but, and they stand back. But what in us makes us stand back? Not the biology, not the emotions, not even the basic superficial logic of our personality. It is these deeper inner parts. In his writings on education, Sri Aurobindo points out, without the psychic being within, without its influence on the surface personality, man is no better than, is only, in fact, he says, is only a thinking animal. What have we got? The same animal base, upon that the power of thought. That's all. The drivers for the thought are still the animal base. But because the psychic being is present, because its influence now comes into your thoughts turn up. Why am I here? Is there something else I should be doing? What about that ideal? Can I realize it? Or even, I feel it should be possible. And that feel comes not from the intellect, not from the emotions, from the psychic. And in the emotions, again, he reaches out, but these are my human beings, my family, my other friends, and I should have a deeper, truer relationship. I feel bad when I hurt somebody. Why? Because of the psychic influence. The sense of conscience comes from the psychic influence, reflected perhaps a couple of times into the emotions, but still. If not for that, we would be, well, even animals have a lot of love for their immediate family, but that's about all that you would have. Not the deeper, truer sense of what comes from the psychic. So, if progress there has been, it is in a circle. At most perhaps in a widening circle. Man today is not wiser than the ancient seers and sages and thinkers. Well, how many Platos do you find? How many of, who's the other Greek thinker, Socrates. If you think about it, that kind of idealism which you see in some of those great types which have inspired large parts of humanity, they have not really reproduced the same level of commitment or idealism that they had. They've inspired with a bit of a lift perhaps, but that's about it. If you think of it in these terms, it was for a long time the declared position of the Roman Catholic Church that God created the world in sometime in 4000 BC. And the date was precisely set. And when the evidence for evolution was produced with the fossils, the church simply said, well, God threw these fossils in when He created the world as a way of deceiving you, to give you the illusion that there has been an evolution. But the thinking in that was precisely this, that we can only grow within the circle. Make your circle bigger. As human beings now, let's widen out in our engagement with a larger part of humanity. But that's it. The greatness of the past sages who were there is your reference only to the extent that they were great people. You cannot be like them. You learn from them in the little bit that you can. That's about it. But when you think of it like this, you do not find the rishis of the past, at least the way we conceive of them. Do you find them today? And even if they are reborn, would they have the same kind of greatness that you see in their earlier cycle? So, man today is not wiser than the ancient seers and sages and thinkers, not more spiritual than the great seekers of old, the first mighty mystics, not superior in arts and crafts to the ancient artists and craftsmen. The old races that have disappeared showed as potent an intrinsic originality, invention, capacity of dealing with life. And if modern man in this respect has gone a little farther, not by any essential progress, but in degree, scope, abundance, it is because he has inherited the achievements of his forerunners. Look at the great artistic products going back a couple of thousand years. You do not see the best of today being any significantly better. You're just using different materials. You're now machine stamping them, mass manufacturing them. That's about all. But you have increased in degree, same thing, slightly more because of better tools. Scope, it's much larger in abundance. But you have built on their work. That's all. Nothing warrants the idea that he will ever hew his way out of the half knowledge, half ignorance, which is the stamp of his kind. Or even if he develops a higher knowledge, that he can break out of the utmost boundary of the mental circle. So again, very fine nuances. Can we really ever get free of this half knowledge, half ignorance? So many religions, even spiritual traditions, declare it is impossible to break out of it. Because that's the nature of the mind, that's the nature of the body in which your mind is bound. There's no way you can get free of the ignorance that the stamp of matter puts on you. And therefore the only way is improve a little bit, or improve as much as you can within the limitation of the body. Then when you cast your body, you will finally be free into some higher consciousness. Till then you cannot break out of this boundary of the mental circle and its ignorance, even if you get to a higher stage within the ignorance. Now with this, he completes one part of the argument. What remains with the other part of the argument is that perhaps there is still a spiritual evolution. Maybe the soul is hopping life forms and growing. So far we do not see any material evolution, there are only types which are growing. But what about the soul evolving? And so he takes up this question. It is tempting and not illogical to regard rebirth as the potential means of a spiritual evolution. The factor that makes it possible Because we can be born now, grow in consciousness in your type, and then hop into the next type, and grow within that, and then hop into the next. But still, he says, it is not certain. Granting rebirth to be a fact, that this is its significance. It is not certain that this is its significance. Rebirth is true, we have accepted, but is rebirth really aiming at some kind of an evolution? And you will see in many traditions where evolution is accepted, in many traditions where rebirth is accepted, they also believe that if you don't behave well, in your next life you may become a donkey. And they will tell you this. So you do not need to have evolution even if you accept rebirth. He takes up this position. All the ancient theories about reincarnation supposed it to be a constant transmigration of the soul from animal to human, but also from human to animal bodies. The Indian idea added the explanation of karma, of a return for good or evil done, of a result of past will and effort. But there was no suggestion of a progressive evolution from type to higher type. Still less of birth into a kind of being that has never yet existed but has still to evolve in the future. So these ideas don't exist. What you have, and you will see some of this in the Buddhist tradition, some of it in the Vedantic, later Vedantic tradition, that if you do a lot of good, punya, good merit, then you will have a higher birth. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says that if you grow and do good, then you will have a greater birth in a better circumstance conducive for your spiritual awakening. And that idea is strong. But the reverse idea comes with it. If you do bad, papa, or any dismerit, then you will drop to a lower level, lower life form. You will suffer in a worse body or in a worse environment for growth. Now the problem with this, of course, is in the form it takes in mind of people is, what is a better environment? I'm more rich, I'm more famous. So the assumption is there in those who have grown up with this kind of thinking that the rich people should be more evolved. And the poor people, therefore, are the ones who are still struggling because of their bad karma or their bad past choices. And you can see how if you stay within this, there is no idea of human to a supra-human species. Within the human, you can just get better, or you may even drop below human into animal consciousness. If evolution there is, then man is the last stage. Because through him, there can be the rejection of terrestrial or embodied life and an escape into some heaven or nirvana. This is the viewpoint in those traditions which simply say, get into a better life in the human, so that through that you will be able to awaken to a higher consciousness or a gateway through which you will leap out and get free. When you tell these kinds of things to young people and you associate these ideas with spirituality, what's the natural response? Sorry, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in doing a lot of suffering to gain some merit in order to have a better life, in order to get out of it. For what? I'm happy with what I have. I want to enjoy my life. This kind of thinking was very attractive at a time when humanity was largely suffering. In Europe, during the Dark Ages, when survival was unsure at any stage, get out of it. That's a relief. At least you will have a better life in your heavenly domain. In India, you will find the same idea getting exaggerated during the period, in about 500 years ago, during the peak of the Mughal rule in the northern parts of India, or when there was an enormous decline in the quality of life. Under British rule, similarly, under colonial rule, there were a series of famines from 1850 to 1900, where 30 million people died of starvation. That was at that point more than 10% of the population. And survival was unsure. People did not know what would happen next. They were willing to literally sell their own lives for some benefit for their family. That was the time when the British also took people away as indentured labor to all their properties elsewhere in the world, creating the diaspora of Indians later. But all of that was the period when survival and life itself was seen as something so painful and so difficult that with a bit of good merit, anyway I'm suffering, let me suffer a little more and be good to others so that I have a better life and eventually get out of this whole domain of struggle and suffering. Today, especially in the parts of the world where physical comforts, economic comforts, and even the intellectual possibilities of enjoyment of thought or enjoyment of emotions with the media, wonderful cinema, beautiful dance and programs of theatre makes life so pleasurable and enjoyable, why should you want to get out of it? And suddenly that very comfort of life makes the young question and even discard at least the spirituality that comes with these values. But there is nobody speaking of a spirituality which has other values, which would fulfill their enjoyment even more profoundly perhaps, but on a higher plane. And even if you offer that, you say, yeah, but I'm quite happy with what I have. Why should I seek a higher grade of enjoyment? If evolution there is, then man is the last step because of this. He says, some heaven or nirvana. That was the end envisaged by the ancient theories. And since this is fundamentally and unchangeably a world of ignorance, even if all cosmic existence is not in its nature a state of ignorance, that escape is likely to be the true end of the cycle. So he is so perfect in his argument. He says, if you accept the world is a unchangeably world of ignorance, then that end is the only thing you can do, getting out of it. But even if you accept that all of the world, all of cosmic existence is not ignorance, but this world is ignorance, and so we get out of this world into some other beyond. And with this, he completes that whole anti-evolutionary position, both on a material level and on the spiritual level. This, he says now in the next paragraph, this is a line of reasoning that has a considerable cogency and importance. And it was necessary to state it, even if too briefly, for its importance. He says we have stated it but very briefly. In fact, one could go much more deep in it to justify it, but he has picked the key points, which now he will identify, he will isolate and counter step by step. For although some of its propositions are valid, its view of things is not complete, and its cogency is not conclusive. That's the point first now. Yes, these are valid statements which we have seen, but they are not complete. There is more to it. There is layer 2, there is layer 3. And although there is a cogency, that cogency does not include further facts which could contradict it. And first, we may without much difficulty get rid of the objections to the teleological element, which the idea of a predetermined evolution from inconscience to superconscious, the development of a rising order of beings with a culminating transition from life of the ignorance to a life in the knowledge, brings into the structure of the terrestrial existence. So we get rid of the teleological element that these ideas bring to the idea, to the structure of earthly life. What are the ideas? The idea that there is a predetermined evolution. That evolution is going to go from inconscience all the way to superconscious, and that is set as a pattern from the beginning. This was one of the ideas which was discarded in the earlier position. The rising order of beings culminating in a life of knowledge out of ignorance. And these are the two great ideas. And when you bring them, they bring, of course, a lot of problems in the structure of terrestrial existence. The objection to a teleological cosmos can be based on two very different grounds. Now he's going to counter that position that says that there is no purpose. And when you say there is no purpose, it has two bases. First is a scientific reasoning proceeding on the assumption that all is the work of an inconscient energy which acts automatically by mechanical process and can have no element of purpose in it. This is the position of modern science. What does science say? It's just happening because there's an energy which is doing its thing. And by chance things fell into place, by chance these things emerged, and there are certain natural laws of survival, etc., which ensure that there is some kind of an appearance of progress and evolution, but it doesn't mean there's a goal to it. Now, this idea is extremely powerful, and we have to understand what it has done to humanity. One of the practical results of this scientific concept of evolution is life has no purpose. Because everything is happening by chance. Why are you here? By chance, because some molecules fell into place. So what do you do when life has no purpose? Well, enjoy yourself. Fulfill the satisfaction of the moment and of your desires and impulses, because there is no point to it. And if there is no point to it, you need not strive for anything higher. Large parts of humanity today are filled with this pointlessness of life. What it has done is, the only practical purpose has been fulfilling desires, drive of ambition, which has given you some kind of a purpose to growth. But the moment you fulfill those, suddenly life becomes empty, hollow. And this is the interesting thing you notice. The parts of the world where people are most comfortable, where all their needs have been taken care of, are the parts where you have the highest suicide rates. In some parts of Europe, in India, the state which had the highest level of education was Kerala, also with the highest suicide rate. Why? The education taught them that there's no purpose to life. So the moment you have risen sufficiently in your level of comforts, now what? Poof. You fall into severe depression. What do? I can do everything, and I am doing everything, but now nothing satisfies me anymore. It's the problem of the wealthy. You see, the poor person does not have this problem so much because they're still struggling to survive. But once you've reached a level of wealth, now what? And then you look for other things to escape the sorrow of existence. And that's when people turn to drugs and other means to somehow find some momentary lift of, oh, now it feels so nice, until the drug passes, and then I'm in a darker space because of the contrast. This problem is so severe today that increasingly people are turning in large numbers to psychiatric drugs as a way of overcoming this kind of underlying sense of depression, which comes from the purposelessness of life. This is so important to understand for us because it is now a severe problem for humanity. So the scientific reasoning, which says there is only an inconscient energy acting mechanically with no element of purpose. And the second objection to the sense of purpose of life, of the cosmos, is in the metaphysical level. So physical science and then the metaphysical reasoning. And a metaphysical reasoning which proceeds on the perception that the infinite and universal has everything in it already. That it cannot have something unaccomplished to accomplish. Something to add to itself, to work out, to realize. And there can therefore be in it no element of progress, no original or emergent purpose. So already the infinite has everything. Why does the infinite need to create something, some new step of evolution? It's all there. And this you will find even today in many of the Vedantic schools of thought, even in India. Of course, it is equally there in some of the Abrahamic schools. And I want to give one example which was very vivid for me. It was as part of one of those interfaith discussions that I was present with, and it came from a particular Sufi lineage which considers itself very advanced, very modern. It has taken even elements of reincarnation, or at least accepted possibilities of these. And their founder is somebody from Europe. Their greatest interpreter is somebody from Europe whose name I have forgotten. And subsequent to that interaction, one of the persons gave me the photocopy of his book, where he takes up the challenge of countering Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary position. And this was the logic, in fact, presented there. Why should the infinite, why should the divine ever need anything more? We do not need anymore a monstrosity of Superman. That is how he worded it. In his understanding of Superman or supramental being, there was this idea of an exaggeration of the human vital. That's how he formulated it. It was a very mixed understanding, but it ended with this idea: we do not need anymore this monstrosity of a Superman. The world is complete as it is. The divine is complete in his expression of it. All is good. Nothing to worry. What's the conclusion? You only have to follow the law of God, obey God, so that you will be rewarded in heaven eventually. Meanwhile, you do good on earth as one of the means of the reward. And that was it. And this is very powerful. When I have met with groups which are rooted in that kind of teaching, even in India, in the later Vedantic tradition, as Sri Aurobindo puts it, they do not have also the concept of an evolution. They realize the evolution of the soul, but not an evolution where a new step in evolution in the physical world is required. The world itself does not seem to evolve. It changes, it grows, but not evolution. They accept even physical evolution, but not this kind of a spiritual emergence of a new step. And one of the ways by which I found I could articulate the concept of evolution was this. I said, yes, the divine is complete. It is all completeness. It is equally infinite potential. So as the divine pours out into the universe, nothing ever repeats, and always something new emerges, and always something new. The result of the new emergence, which is not a product of previous forms, the result of the new emergence is the appearance of an evolution. And they said, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So you got to the concept of evolution in a framework that is more like an appearance, because the all completeness of the divine keeps pouring out unendingly. And so it was a way for them to accept this view, but not quite break out of their frame of belief. And it will be interesting to see how Sri Aurobindo counters this, because you can see how compelling the idea is. The infinite and universal has everything in it already. Therefore, no element of progress, no original or emergent purpose. Now Sri Aurobindo counters both. The scientific or materialist objection cannot maintain its validity if there is a secret consciousness in or behind the apparently inconscient energy in matter. So his solution is very simple. So far science said there is only this energy. Energy moves this way, that way. These are the formulae of physics, chemistry, by which we describe the energy process. But it is mechanical energy. Having accepted that, if there is a secret consciousness in that energy, or behind that apparently inconscient energy in matter. So Sri Aurobindo's position is very simple. He accepts all that. He says, yes, all this is true. But this inconscience of energy is only an appearance. Within that, secretly, is a consciousness working through that inconscience. Or you can say, behind it supporting is a consciousness working through this appearance. Even in the inconscient, there seems to be at least an urge of inherent necessity producing the evolution of forms, and in the forms a developing consciousness. And it may well be held that this urge is the evolutionary will of a secret conscious being, and its push of progressive manifestation the evidence of an innate intention in the evolution. This is the teleological element, and it is not irrational to admit it. So here's the sense of purpose coming in, and he says he is putting it very rationally. If you look carefully in the inconscient, the evidence before you, and it is the scientific observed evidence, there seems to be at least an urge of inherent necessity producing the evolution of forms. Something is creating forms. When you look at the subatomic particles in their chaotic movement, something somehow puts them together to bind to create a stable atom. Somehow those stable atoms join to create stable molecules and more complex molecules, and somehow it seems to happen. The fact that it happens itself is an evidence that there's an urge which is pushing in that direction. There's a directedness in the physical evolution which you cannot ignore. And that itself, he says, may be the evidence of the sense of purpose. So Sri Aurobindo logically puts it this way: if you see a sense of purpose which has pushed matter all the way through plant, through animal, to the human level, maybe unconscious energy, but it has pushed it all the way, why should it stop there? Why not it continues further? And again, rationally, scientifically, you'll say, yeah, there's no reason why it should stop. The moment you've accepted this chain, a next step becomes almost, yes, of course, it's possible. But will it? We don't know. But there's no reason why it should not be. Second point he shows you is, as the form emerges, there is also, it may well be held that this urge is the evolutionary will of a secret conscious being. Also, so as the form emerges, there is also in the forms a developing consciousness. So the quality of awareness which you see in the plant increases with the sophistication of the form. In the animal, as the form becomes more sophisticated, consciousness emerges. So you can map it to the brain, for example, in the animals. The more the number of neurons, the more complex the expression of consciousness. Now, it's not always true. We can see, for example, the whale has a brain which is bigger than the human, far bigger. But is it more conscious? At least we do not see in its behavior a greater consciousness. Even in the human being, sometimes just because you have a brain which is larger doesn't make you more intelligent. But what we see is complexity of interconnections seem to match intelligence. So when the interconnections grow in complexity and in numbers, somehow intelligence does seem to increase. And for this he says, it may be, as an argument, it can be said that this urge is the evolutionary will of a secret conscious being, and its push of progressive manifestation is the evidence of this innate intention. There is a secret being, conscious, behind, which is the source of this urge pushing. Once you've accepted that behind this unconscious energy, there's a secret consciousness, and that secret consciousness has an intention, the rest can be accepted at least. Can we now push it more than just acceptance that it's possible? It is not irrational to admit it, he says. For the consciousness or even the inconscient nisus, urge, push as the nisus, arises from a truth of conscious being that has become dynamic and set out to fulfill itself in an automatic process of material nature. So what he is describing here, the mechanism of evolution, this conscious being feels within it a certain truth. I can be this, I want to be this, I am this. And it as if throws it into this unconscious machinery of nature. And that wheels the machinery, modifies, utilizes it until it eventually comes out. It's a very interesting description here. The mechanism by which these forms have come into being is shown to you. And it's not contradicting the earlier discussions. Remember earlier Sri Aurobindo showed you that any form, you can go back to a small, tiny beginning out of which this more complex type has emerged. But that tiny beginning, where did it come from? Well, somehow it fell into place. That's all physics will say or biology will say. And here he's telling you, the urge is something of that conscious being that sees a truth in itself, pushing out and wants to be it, and that becomes in the machinery which is mechanical, the energy which is mechanical, it becomes a nudge, a push. And if you persist in a nudge, random pieces will fall along the line of the nudge. And so randomness is as if the process which is used by the nudge to make itself happen. I'll give you an analogy here. If you take fine powder of iron and just throw it like that, it will scatter, a random pattern. But if below the sheet on which you throw, you put secretly a magnet, as this random pattern scatters and falls, it touches the magnetic field and is slightly modified, slightly slanted. And what falls is a neat pattern representing the magnetic field. Has the magnet created the pattern? No. It is the random falling which has been influenced by the magnet. You never see the magnet. It is behind. It is hidden in that part of the secret consciousness. But because it is there, its subtle influence is tiny, creating tiny modifications in what is otherwise a random process. Now you can see here how important this random process is. If there was not a randomness, if I had dropped all the pieces of iron with great force so that they fall exactly where I throw them, you would not get this clear pattern. But because I threw them in a random, chaotic way, the chaos was the means by which a tiny nudge could quickly bring out something. Now this is a point Sri Aurobindo makes elsewhere, even in his descriptions of human events, where things are tightly bound in process, in dependencies, in compulsions of society, political or financial. You have very little scope for progress. Where there is freedom, where there is possibility for each individual to do what it wants, there suddenly something can emerge. If everything is in a gridlock, nothing can move. So if you want really a great possibility to emerge, a base of fluctuation which is free and fluid is absolutely necessary. He puts this in the context of our spiritual evolution also. If you want to grow into a higher grade of consciousness, there has to be a basis of freedom, where you can actually experiment with your own consciousness to become aware and try out and see how you can best develop it. If you're so deeply locked into social or other compulsions, you do not have a possibility of making mistakes. You cannot grow. If you live in fear, you're bound to always safe activity. You cannot grow. If you're compelled into safe activity by social pressure, you cannot grow. So the first requirement for any spiritual evolution is freedom, which includes freedom to make mistakes and through mistakes to grow. But this is the base which you have, the appearance of freedom in mechanical energy is this fluctuating randomness. The way physics describes it, in so-called empty space, there are particles which are always appearing and disappearing. And it does not break the laws of physics. Because as long as two particles appear, which are effectively neutralizing each other, they can both exist. And as long as they are within a tiny period of time, they can exist and even be active and vanish. No laws are disturbed. So for example, out of pure empty space, you can have an electron and a positron, that is an electron with a positive charge, emerge just like that out of emptiness and move into different directions. If all the time electrons and positrons are in fact appearing and disappearing all the time, you have this seething underlying chaotic base, which is in fact the concept we have in a particular field of quantum physics, which is called quantum electrodynamics. They view empty space as full of seething chaotic energy particles appearing and disappearing all the time. And now what do you need? This nisus, this little nudge and urge that is put out by the secret consciousness in this mechanical energy, like a magnetic field. I want this. And suddenly in that fluctuation there's a pattern that begins to emerge, particles begin to join and form, and something stable comes out. Following what? The field of influence of the magnet, the field of the influence of the will of this nisus. So you see what he's describing is so interesting. I reread the line. The conscious or even the inconscient nisus arises from a truth of conscious being that has become dynamic and set out to fulfill itself in an automatic process of material nature. In the human experience, something similar happens. Suddenly within you say, I want to do this. And the very fact that your consciousness turns to, I want to do, what happens in your biology? Your heart starts beating faster, your certain hormones are released which prepare the body now for movement, and the energy starts to shift and turn in the direction of your wanting. And the same thing happens here. In that consciousness concealed, I want to become flower, I want to express this quality as flower, and the chain begins to happen in mechanical nature. And the next sentence takes it a step deeper. The teleology, the element of purpose in the nisus, is the translation of a self-operative truth of being into terms of self-effective willpower of that being. And if consciousness is there, such a willpower must also be there, and the translation is normal and inevitable. Now here we have gone into third layer, where the conclusion is not only this is normal, but this is inevitable. This urge which will drive evolution now becomes normal and inevitable. So let's understand what is this normal and inevitable. The translation of a self-operative truth of being into terms of self-effective willpower of that being. If there is within me a truth of my being, I am a creative person, and this truth exists, it is operating by itself, it doesn't need anything, it is me in being, then it translates into self-effective willpower of that being. If it is there as a truth of being, it becomes willpower of being inevitably. If there is consciousness and consciousness has truth of being, it has to become willpower of being, because all consciousness is force of consciousness. And if consciousness holds a truth, well, the form of that truth as will of truth must follow. It is normal, it is inevitable. So if consciousness is there, such a willpower must also be there, and the translation is normal and inevitable. Now here we have come to an extraordinary conclusion, that yes, we accept the mechanical energy of science, behind it we accept now a consciousness of which this is an energy, and therefore whatever is truth in that consciousness must inevitably follow as will of that consciousness, and it must work through this energy, even if the process appears to us unconscious and random or chaotic. But it must emerge inevitably. truth of being inevitably fulfilling itself would be the fundamental fact of the evolution. But will and its purpose must be there as part of the instrumentation, as an element in the operative principle. So this now goes to the core of the evolutionary mechanism. First, truth of being, the fact that the consciousness exists like this. Because this consciousness is happy, well, whatever it creates must be happy. Because this consciousness is beauty, whatever flows out in form must be beautiful. That's why you look at the universe, it's beautiful. Otherwise you wouldn't explain it. You notice human beings bring ugliness. But in nature, all those so-called random processes of wind carving stone, water cutting through stone, creating valleys, all those random processes, every scene is beautiful. You take a telescope and shoot it any part of the universe, focus on any star, any galaxy, and you can see those images today. Wow, so beautiful. Such a splendor of rich play of colors. Each unique, even it appears random in a way, just like an artist has thrown wildly some colors. But it's beautiful, it's never ugly. You cannot find ugliness in nature, except where a human being has gone and done something. And why do we do that? Because within us is the ugliness. We are only putting in an operative form what we are. The conflict or hard rigidity, chaos which is in us is what we express. But in nature, who is the one who's doing it? This consciousness behind this conscious being has none of that. So whatever flows through the screen of this random play and mechanical energy must be what it is. Beautiful. So, truth of being inevitably fulfilling itself would be the fundamental fact of evolution. It has to fulfill itself, and inevitable, nothing can prevent it. Now this point is critical, because if truth of being is supramental, supramental must be fulfilled, nothing can prevent it. If truth of being was only rational, well, nothing could prevent rationality, but it would stop there. But if truth of being is supramental, yes, rationality would be a part of its expression. But truth of being of supramental has an infinite rationality, not a finite rationality. It has a transcendence of limits of rationality, which also must be fulfilled, and therefore that is also inevitable. Now you see how by going to this deep root of the evolutionary mechanism and source, everything now becomes inevitable and obvious. And all those arguments in the past which were placed against evolution, yes, they were true in the surface first layer, but going into second and third layer, you can see how that truth is greater than this truth and uses this as a screen, as a front to manifest itself. So truth of being inevitably fulfilling itself would be the fundamental fact of the evolution, but what is the mechanism by which it fulfills? But will and its purpose must be there as part of the instrumentation, as an element in the operative principle. So if I am beauty, then that beauty will reflect. But how? The mechanism of its reflection into this will be will and its purpose. I am beauty, I will to express the beauty that I am. I cannot express something which I am not, obviously. But I am all potential now as the underlying being, conscious being behind, and so I express all that. But I don't express all that in one go. I express this first and that. And so there is the aspect of the will and the purpose that the will brings to express my beauty, to express my completeness is the longer goal. And so if expression of completeness is one of the intentions, eventually it cannot stop with the human being, it has to go a step further, and as many steps as necessary for the completeness. So will and its purpose must be there as part of the instrumentation, the means by which it does it, as an element in the operative principle. And with this, Sri Aurobindo has set aside the scientific or materialistic objection to evolution and the sense of purpose in evolution. Now, if you look at modern science, is modern science up to? All matter is energy, but the energy is mechanical. What do we need to do now? Recognize that the mechanical energy is conscious energy, or in the front, subconscious or inconscient, but behind, secretly, conscious energy. Energy is an expression of consciousness. It is consciousness become energy, which becomes matter. If you bring back that last step of consciousness behind, then whatever that consciousness is must be what drives the energy to create its forms and express itself. And if that consciousness is complete, transcends reason, then it must express not only reason but continue beyond the reason to express its transcendence. Evolution is not ended until it goes to this purpose, because it has to represent itself. Therefore, there is a goal to evolution, there is a direction to evolution. The direction is towards increasing consciousness, becoming more and more the nature of the consciousness which is behind, and the goal is to eventually fully represent it. And our discussion is complete in countering the limitation of the argument which comes with science and the materialism of science. Now he takes up the metaphysical objection. The metaphysical objection is more serious, for it seems self-evident that the Absolute can have no purpose in manifestation except the delight of manifestation itself. So remember, the metaphysical objection was that the infinite and the universe already has everything in it. There's nothing which it needs to add. And so when you look at this, you will say, yes, the infinite already has everything. Why does it need? And even what it has put out, why has it put out? It has no need to put out anything. This is the common argument given even to those who question from a spiritual Vedantic perspective, when they say, but why evolution? You don't need evolution. The divine has no need. The divine at best can express himself because it's the joy of expression. Then that's all. So no purpose in manifestation except the delight of manifestation itself. And even that was not a compulsion. So an evolutionary movement in matter as part of the manifestation must fall within this universal statement. So even in the material world, it should be only for the delight. It can be there only for the delight of the unfolding, the progressive execution, the objectless, serried self-revelation. So now when you say the divine is, the consciousness is supramental and it is expressing itself in matter, what is it doing? There's no object expressed except for the delight. The consciousness has no need to put out a supramental being. It's just putting out all the possibilities of its delight, and that's all there is to it. Even the delight of the unfolding, the progressive execution, well, out of plant, animal, human, okay, that's also part of the delight. A universal totality may also be considered as something complete in itself. As a totality, it has nothing to gain or to add to its fullness of being. So when you say the whole universe is an expression of that totality, and that's it, it's enough. But now the counter Sri Aurobindo offers. But here the material world is not an integral totality. It is a part of the whole, a grade in a gradation. It may admit in it, therefore, not only the presence of undeveloped, immaterial principles or powers belonging to the whole that are involved within its matter, but also a descent into it of the same powers from the higher gradations of the system to deliver their kindred movements here from the strictness of a material limitation. And so he is bringing you the mechanism now. In countering, he is also revealing the mechanism. Remember, always the purpose of the divine will be to reveal, even for delight, but his whole eventually. But that's all you can say. But here there is a band in matter which is very limited. It does not have in it the whole. And so, for the purpose of the delight, there can be the possibility that the things which are missing in matter choose to enter in matter and play out the possibility of more than what matter has. They can descend into it from a higher gradation of the system which is complete, and from here, from within the limits that matter offers, play out what they can be. And this would be part of the reality of the whole. A manifestation of the greater powers of existence, till the whole being itself is manifest in the material world in the terms of a higher spiritual creation, may be considered as the teleology of the evolution. So the idea is very simple now. The sense of purpose comes from everything which is in the cosmos being able to play in matter and reveal itself in matter. That's all. For the delight, you can say. But that delight is not there or is not complete until all the possibilities which are there beyond matter find their play inside matter. And that you could call a purpose, a sense of direction, the teleology. This teleology does not bring in any factor that does not belong to the totality. Well, everything is there. Nothing is new. It was always there in the whole. Except now it's focusing on matter for its play. That's all. It proposes only the realization of the totality in the part. If there is any part which does not contain the whole play, well, the whole play might want to engage with that part and find its fulfillment there. There can be no objection to the admission of a teleological factor in a part movement of the universal totality. This is brilliant as a logic, as a lawyer arguing his case. You have always said, well, the whole play is there for the play. There is no other purpose. But in the whole play where there is no purpose, you can accept that a part of the play might have a purpose. Not that the divine needs to manifest anything because it's all manifested anyway. But in the part where the manifestation is not obvious, there can be a purpose within the play. The play can put on a front, you see, of purpose. Not the divine needing a purpose. Not a purpose in the human sense, but the urge of an intrinsic truth necessity conscious in the will of the indwelling spirit. So it's not human being, I have a purpose which I need to do, but it is more as if there is in the truth of that consciousness, the urge which is intrinsic to it, it is complete and therefore it must be complete here even in the form. And that's all. Not I have to do, but the push to be complete. That's all it is. If the purpose is the perfect manifestation, if the purpose is the perfect manifestation there of all the possibilities inherent in the total movement. So all the totality, everything which is there already is there because the divine is complete. And the purpose is to put that fullness, experience that and play that in a part which is refusing to or unable to share in the fullness. And the only part in the universe which has this resistance is the inconscience, the part which is dull and unable to somehow contain the experience of the whole. And so he completes this line of thinking. All exists here, no doubt, for the delight of existence. All is a game or lila, but a game too carries within itself an object to be accomplished, and without the fulfillment of that object would have no completeness of significance. So this is another very fine argument, very subtle. So all is a play. But in the play, implied is the sense that there is something that needs to be played out. It's a very subtle idea. You can say a play which is aimless. No, you cannot. A play which is aimless is not a play. Implied in the whole idea of a game is some sense of the play. So it would not have a completeness without this significance. It has a meaning. We are not saying it must do something, but there must be a meaning to the play. And the meaning to the play may simply be the joy of the play, which is to be experienced fully, or the fullness of all possibilities to be played out. But still some significance is there. So a drama without denouement, without an unfolding, with an end which reveals something of the sense of purpose. A drama without denouement may be an artistic possibility, existing only for the pleasure of watching the characters and the pleasure in problems posed without solution, or with a forever suspended dubious balance of solution. The drama of the earth evolution might conceivably be of that character, but an intended or inherently predetermined denouement is also and the more convincingly possible. Now here he is bringing out his mastery of a playwright as a storyteller. And we have seen, all of us have had some occasion to see movies where in fact these things are done as an artistic movie. Now if you've ever been to art festivals of cinema, often you come across movies where there's an abrupt ending. You're not given an answer. The person now has the choice. Through the movie, the crisis is built, the crisis is almost resolved, and the lead character has to make a choice. Will I do this or will I do that? And at the last moment where he thinks, the movie stops. And the director will say, I left it to the audience to choose what ending they like. But as a moviegoer, as a normal person, you'll say, that's not satisfying. I want to see what happens when he does. What is the compulsion which makes him choose this over that? I want to see it and experience it. And so, as an artistic possibility, for the pleasure of enjoying this whole thing, the problem is posed but solution is not given. The fellow is left eternally confused when the movie ends at the point of his greatest confusion. Somehow you are not satisfied. But it's possible. Forever suspended, dubious balance of solution. I might do this, I might do that, and poof, it stops. And now in your consciousness, forever it ends there. The drama of earth evolution might be like that. We are always on the brink, maybe we will go there, maybe we will not. And it's left to the choice. It could be like that also. Let's decide at the end of the play what will be the solution we choose, what direction we do. Shall we just end it suddenly or make a growth for some higher possibility? You could say the whole universe is artistically going to decide at the last minute. But, he says, an intended or inherently predetermined denouement is also and more convincingly possible. So equally the argument might go the other way. You could have an intended purpose. You could have a predetermined outcome. But to accept this will be more convincing for us. Because if the divine wants to fulfill himself, there has to be something towards which, or which represents for the divine fulfillment the acme, the peak. And that is much more likely. And then he comes to the argument or the insight which makes this likelihood the inevitable. Ananda is the secret principle of all being and the support of all activity of being. But Ananda does not exclude a delight in the working out of a truth inherent in being. So we started with the idea that the whole point of this is it's pointless, it is just delight, right? So yes, Ananda is the secret principle of all being and the support of all activity of being. So we have to understand this. What you are, you don't need to be, you don't need to become. What you are simply is Ananda and is supporting what you are. That is the Sat, Chit, Ananda, but with the Sat emphasized in Ananda. But you become conscious of what you are, and in your awareness of what you are, you can play out the possibilities of what you are. And that takes it to the activity of being. I now become what I am. And even this becoming is supported by the Ananda. And this is the aspect of the Chit and the Ananda. So Sat and Ananda supporting, Chit and Ananda expressing, manifesting. But Ananda does not exclude a delight in the working out of a truth inherent in being. So there is also now the Ananda of the Sat, knowing itself, turning now to express itself in the Chit and its Ananda. So you see two poises of Ananda. Ananda supporting being, Ananda supporting activity of being, but there is also Ananda of moving from being to becoming. What a profound insight. Now if you left out that Ananda, your Ananda would be incomplete. And perhaps if you think about it, the Ananda from being to becoming might be even greater Ananda than just being in and becoming separately. Isn't it? If you think about this, it is so essential, so important. If we had sat down and thought about this problem for years, even for centuries, we might not have come to this insight, which he presents so lucidly, so simply, and so obviously, that there is this Ananda of moving from being to becoming. But Ananda does not exclude a delight in the working out of a truth inherent in being, immanent in the force or will of being. This is another aspect of that Ananda. In the force which is working in the play, inside that also is this present as a potential. So the truth inherent in being is present inside the force or the will of being. Think about it. When the energy is released now to form the universe, the energy works out. You can say now she is mechanical. But what is she formed of? This consciousness which released. And when it released the energy, inside that energy is working is this being, inherent. You cannot separate it. It is as if present inside the energy, supporting at each step. And if it is supporting at each step, it is right now inside the thing the energy whirls. When the energy whirls to create the whirlpool, at the core of the whirlpool is the origin of the whirlpool sitting. So if the energy is moving to form a flower, the consciousness of flower that inspired, the experience of flower that inspired this movement is right now present inside it, seated within, directing the unfolding of the flower. And that delight of unfolding is also there. So let's reread this. There is delight of working out of a truth inherent in being, immanent in force or will of being, upheld in the hidden self-awareness of its conscious force. That same movement, that truth of being, is held up in the hidden awareness of its conscious force. In the fact that there is a plant and the plant is growing is the truth of the leaf waiting to emerge, the truth of the flower waiting to emerge. In the stone is the truth of the plant waiting to emerge. In the human being is the Superman waiting to emerge. But they are all there, inherent. You cannot separate them. Upheld in the hidden awareness of its conscious force, which is the dynamic and executive agent of its activities and the knower of their significance. So inside the force is already this principle seated, present. You cannot separate it from its origination. Because this power. This conscious force is the executive of that, and so that has to be present in. And this force is also the knower of their significance. That is, every truth that the divine experiences himself to be, I am flower, I am bee, the consciousness which is playing out knows the meaning of what is it to be bee, knows the meaning of what it is to be flower, and the whole spiritual meaning of it, not just a mental idea, the meaning of this experience of flowerness, she knows entirely, which he holds in that poise of being. So with this, we are seeing now that the drama has to unfold, because inherent in the movement of the energy is the sense of purpose, of the will, of the truth of that consciousness, which needs to be worked out by the will which is active, because she already knows it. And she cannot but fulfill it, therefore. So now with this, Sri Aurobindo has also answered the metaphysical objection, which said that, well, the divine is complete, you don't need an evolution. Now we see that the completeness can play out its completeness within a part, and there can be a purpose in fulfilling itself in that part without ever missing out the sense of completeness. And in that part where it's playing out, the divine potential in the being is always present in the energy that is flowing, in the consciousness that is working out, and must therefore fulfill the full play of the delight of drawing out what is potential into what is being unfolded. And the delight is most complete when this is also included. And the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo now distinguishes this evolutionary perspective which he has laid from the physical evolutionary perspective. There is a spiritual evolution and there is a material evolution, but the two are very different. It is not as if you have taken Darwin's evolution and plugged it into spirituality. There is a fundamental difference, and this needs to be recognized. I've actually heard this in a video that was made about Auroville, where somebody says Sri Aurobindo took the Eastern idea of spirituality and the Western idea of evolution and created spiritual evolution. It was not quite that, and this difference is so important to be, it must be now addressed. So a theory of spiritual evolution is not identical with a scientific theory of form evolution and physical life evolution. It must stand on its own inherent justification. And then first he will describe what is different, and then he will show how they relate to each other and how the spiritual evolution can use physical evolution as necessary. So all of that will be what we will take up next Sunday. For now we look back at the extraordinary insight that Sri Aurobindo gives to us by first of all justifying all these viewpoints which deny evolution and their truth, and then showing the layers behind which make for the necessity of an evolution, both through the material action in a mechanical energy as well as a spiritual action in the sense of purpose that the divine consciousness has in expressing its delight. And this vision gives to us deep within not only a deep satisfaction, but also with it the clarity and inevitability, the certainty of the next step in the evolution. Because if human being is the last step, then that process is incomplete. The divine potential unfolding is not yet satisfied. The delight which is revealed is not yet complete. And it does not contradict the fact that divine is always complete in itself. But in the material world, in the physical expression of the totality of the universe, something is incomplete in the full expression of delight. And that must inevitably be. One of the implications of this whole discussion is the seed for that being, the seed for that becoming, is already within us. In the very seed of in the very core of our consciousness, where we are one with that divine being. And if that divine being is our base, is our source, then in our progressive unfolding and awakening, that has to be eventually complete. The power, the consciousness, the energy which forms and develops this already knows what needs to be done. If we put ourselves consciously in her hands as a conscious energy of the Lord, as the divine Shakti, as the divine mother, then she already knows what is to be done. She already carries with her the significance of that experience and can rapidly shape us to become whatever needs to be fulfilled. So there is a letter of Sri Aurobindo where a disciple asks him this question. The disciple says, so and so person told me in the ashram that if I surrender myself entirely to the mother, then she can transform me instantly. Is it true? Sri Aurobindo says, yes, it is true. But you have to surrender yourself entirely. You see, the logic is so compelling. To the part of you that is not surrendered, of course her action cannot be immediate. But to the part of you that is surrendered, the action will be instantaneous. The challenge for us is only to bring into awareness first of what we are, and then to turn that awareness in a complete surrender, not a partial surrender. If you look at the logic of this, that she already carries and she knows already, she has the power to shape and transform you. What is preventing is only the fact that you are not conscious, and even to the part that you're conscious, you are not able to fully surrender. And if you fulfill these two criteria, becoming more and more conscious and surrendering more and more completely, the rest she does then. And the entire process of the transformation could be reduced to these two keywords, or to these two steps. And so Sri Aurobindo formulates it with three fundamental processes: aspiration, rejection, surrender. Because you cannot even become conscious unless there is an aspiration to be conscious. And that consciousness itself you cannot develop because you are so unconscious of yourself unless she helps you. So your aspiration has to turn to her and open as if a part of you, in which she can then fill and make you more conscious. And with that consciousness you will grow in plasticity, which will allow you then to be able to surrender more and more completely, which whatever partial surrender will allow her force to enter you more completely, to make you more conscious and therefore more plastic and therefore more capable of complete surrender. And that will be the cycle of the transformation. So he says in the same text of the little booklet, The Mother, three things you must have: consciousness, plasticity, surrender. And it goes in that sequence. You become conscious. With that consciousness, you grow in plasticity, which allows you then to unshape your rigid, mechanical, self-centered, instinctive working of consciousness, to put yourself in her hands, for which you have to be plastic enough to be able to reshape, to put in contact. And with the surrender comes the increase of consciousness, increase of plasticity, and increase of surrender, and so on. But this I'm adding as the logical culmination of what he has shown to us as the very core mechanism of evolution and the sense of purpose of our life and of the universe and everything. We can meditate on this for a few minutes and we'll continue next Sunday.